Test recording.
So much.
Yeah, so we don't want to start recording now.
Series, which is a series of a few events throughout this month, introducing students to Muslim culture and Muslim faith. And since we're on the subject of women, I'll let you guys know that we have a performing arts night next Saturday with a female rapper, comedian, and actress, so you should all check that out. And now I'll introduce our speaker. So Dr. Rania Awaad is a psychiatrist based in Stanford University School of Medicine. Prior to studying medicine, she had various certifications in Islamic sciences from Syria, and she also works in the liberal arts college Zaytuna in Berkeley. She also directs the Rahma Foundation, which is an organization dedicated to educating Muslim women and girls. So she has a lot of expertise on the experience of being a woman and as well in the religious basis of being a Muslim woman. So I'll turn it over to her. I guess I'm going to be seated. How are you guys doing? Good. Good. How's everybody?
Hot.
It's hot. That night is also just running over here, so it's hot. Glad there's a fan right there. So, have you guys been attending other lectures and series or plan to for the rest of the month? Yeah. So hopefully this will be of benefit. So thank you for the bio. It actually speaks to some of the things I'm going to speak about today. So I was asked to speak about women in Islam. And it's interesting because this is a very generic topic, if you will. And I was reflecting on how difficult it is to actually address, well, kind of a very broad topic. And I thought about it, and I thought, I could address this from a lens of, anthropologically or sociologically, or I could talk to you about history. And then I decided, you know what? There's over 1 billion Muslims in the world today. Half of them are women. So for me to try to do justice to 500 million people from all walks of life, from every culture and every language group, from every location on earth, I really could not do that justice in this hour and a half we're going to have together. So what should I do instead? So I thought maybe I'll talk about it from a spiritual perspective, since I have a specialty in that. But then I thought, you know what? What might be even more interesting perhaps is to talk about it from a personal narrative perspective. My own story, so to say. What is it that I have learned about Islam from my own studies and have attempted at least to implement as a Muslim woman? I thought maybe that might be of more use. You guys will let me know. And so, I'll begin and say, and by the way, I know, and granted, I'm not going to be able to really touch on every single aspect of Muslim women. Definitely not based on scripture, and every single item that's listed in scripture, nor the hadith literature, which are narrations of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Nor am I really even going to be able to delve into all the topics of Islamic law that deal with women. For that, you'll have to come attend my year-long course. Muslim women, or women in Islam, that I teach over at the Zaytuna College in Berkeley. So let me start with the obvious. I am a Muslim woman. And a proud Muslim woman at that. I wear the headscarf, the veil. And let me tell you, I'll begin here and say, this is a very conscious choice, based on my own studies, and rigorous studies, as I'm going to talk about in just a bit here. And when I'm asked by people, is your story a typical story of a Muslim woman? I say, I don't know, I guess you'll have to be the judge of that. But I realize it may not necessarily be typical. And while that may be true in the modern era, that's definitely not true historically. So I will touch a little bit on history as we go on here as well. I also want to say that I'm often asked by fellow females, how do you do all that you do? And it's interesting, given all that Islam has to offer to women and to men, and by extension all of humanity, that maybe the questioners should ask themselves why they're not doing more. So let me explain a little bit more, maybe by sharing my own narrative, this point will become a little more clear. I'll start by saying that I wear many hats, and I think the bio kind of touched a little bit on that. But to the passerby, I'm a veiled Muslim woman. And if we stop at that, there's a lot of assumptions, perhaps, that a person may have when they see a woman who looks like me walking down the street. Now, if we base it just on looks, you get very little information about who I actually am and what I represent. For example, you probably would not be able to pick up that I'm a Stanford trained clinician, that I'm on faculty here at the School of Medicine, that I direct a very cool new initiative called the Muslims and Mental Health Research Lab, that I'm a director of a Muslim Wellness and Counseling Center, and that I was the founder of the only, actually, interfaith counseling center that's in the East Bay. Those are credentials, right? But they don't appear readily on a person's outside. You'd have to actually talk to somebody in more depth to really be able to get that information. And you may say to yourself, well, maybe I've seen you on campus before. Perhaps you've even seen me running around the hospital in my white coat. So you say, okay, we got the doctor part. And maybe that's cool. Maybe it's not. But or maybe you've done what all the people, oh my goodness, all through the medical training here at Stanford have done. That in the white coat and the hijab, the headscarf, I tend to get this reaction of all the time. And while that's, it's interesting, and after a while you kind of get immune to it, I realized there was not a lot of Muslim doctors on campus. There's not a lot of Muslims on campus to begin with, and not a lot of Muslims in the hospital system here. But that's not true of most hospital systems across America, let me tell you. There are tons of Muslim doctors, and it seems like American hospitals run on Muslim doctors. But that's just not the case here for whatever reason. And then maybe you'll say to yourself, okay, I get it. These are career type things, but I would say that's only just the tip of the iceberg in terms of my identity. For example, it doesn't actually share, even if you saw me in that white coat, it doesn't speak anything to my journey in studying Islam. So here I'll share with you the interesting fact that I decided to formally study rigorous classical Islamic sciences at a very young age. Yep, I jumped on a plane at the age of 14, I went to Damascus, Syria, and started my studies of Islam. Now, people always ask me, how on earth did your parents let you do that? And I often say, I really don't know, but aren't they cool? It's a country that I have no family in. I'm not from there. I don't have any relatives there or any roots there. But an opportunity presented itself as a young Muslim girl to study the Islamic sciences, and I was really excited about it. From my parents' perspective, they thought of it as a summer abroad, one-time thing, no big deal. Cool cultural experience. Oh boy, were they wrong. It turned out to be something that was a lifelong journey for me. And it really didn't stop there. But you see, at 14, I did the very silly teenage thing to do to your parents. And I called them from Syria and I said, I really love it here. And I think I want to finish school here. So I'll see y'all in a few years. Needless to say, my parents both got on speakerphone and said, you get on the next plane out tomorrow. I was able to negotiate with them to just stay for the rest of the summer. But let me tell you, when I got back, it was really difficult to convince them to send me again. Yet I was so inspired by what I had learned about Islam. That was not passed me down knowledge, that was not cultural baggage, that was not political rhetoric, if you will, but it was much more the actual study of scripture that really inspired me. And even at a young age, I really wanted to continue this study. Now, for my parents, that was a different story. And they had all kinds of excuses, as you might imagine, to say no about me going back. Everything from, but you're a girl. Well, I was a girl the first time you sent me. But you're young. Well, I was young, even younger last summer, or you're alone, you have no family there. And I would say, but now I have a network and friends and people who'll check in on me, host families. And it was such an interesting back and forth negotiation through, this would have been my high school years, kind of negotiating with them to actually go back. So finally I said to them, what would it take for you to allow me to go back and continue my studies? And their response was, thinking that this would be like super difficult hurdles, right? is, well, if you graduate at the top of your class with a 4.0 and get scholarship to college, we'll send you off back to Syria. I said, is that it? All right. and so, you know, not only did I attempt to do everything they had asked, but really went above and beyond, or tried at least. So in 3 years, I completed high school. I did everything I could in terms of taking community college classes, even though my high school had said that's not permitted for a high schooler.
And where did you do this? In what state?
This would have been in Michigan. And AP classes, and as you can imagine, all kinds of things to kind of accelerate my time. And sure enough, did graduate at the top of my class. And sure enough, as college the letters were coming in, one scholarship after another, after another, after another, my parents finally said, okay, fine, we get the point, you can go, and sent me back. And so I spent what would have been my senior year of high school back in Syria studying. And this time, I was really kind of inspired to go further in my studies. You see, I've learned a couple of things about Damascus, which are really important that I'd like to share. And it's kind of difficult sometimes for me currently to talk about Damascus, considering all that's happening over there and how incredibly upside down it is right now. But there was a time when Damascus was a beautiful, beautiful country, very thriving and very safe. The era that I'm talking about, where I was and going back and forth on this journey, there were amazing opportunities for young people to study the Islamic sciences. I had heard and learned from that very first trip I took that Syria, out of all the Muslim countries, Syria was really renowned in the Quranic sciences, so the Quran being our religious scripture, and that they had the highest level of degrees in the Quranic sciences compared to other countries. And I was really excited to actually do this myself, which is a big challenge. And I had also learned that it was only in the decade before my travels that women were started to be permitted to receive these high-level certifications. Now, again, this is not true historically, but this is what I would call in the post-colonial era, when so many functions of traditional Islam had fallen by the wayside. So women really were not at the forefront of scholarship as they had been historically. But there was a revival of this that was coming back, and it was very tangible in Syria. And so the story goes on, and I share all of this, and you'll see where the connection is to women in Islam here, because I really wanted to study the Islamic sciences, and sure enough, by that second trip, at the age of 17, I completed and was actually awarded the Ijaza, or traditional teaching license, in Tajweed, which is proper recitation of Quran in the Hafs recitation. And so, you know, it was a wonderful journey and wonderful time, and probably the most blessed, if you will, blissful years of my life. I really, truly enjoyed being overseas and studying. Now, to complete the story, on the other end, my folks, as you can imagine, wanted me to continue my studies. In fact, one of the excuses they would always give is, well, you need to become a doctor like your father. So, okay, I'll get to that. And so it's interesting because even today, when I speak about what I feel to be very important topics like Islamic law or Muslims' issues in Islamic law or so on and so forth, hundreds of women, huge crowds, hundreds of people, huge crowds, I often will get at least one or two people who come up to me after the lecture and say, nice talk, that was really great, yeah. But what we're really interested in is how you got into medical school. Or how you got into Stanford, which is a question all of you will have to one day answer. And I just go, in my head I'm like, did you not hear everything I just talked about? You know? And I'm like, fine. So then I started to develop this very smart aleck, answer when people ask me this, and I say, you know how I got into med school? I got into med school, here's a big secret, trying to get to Damascus to study Islam. Totally throws them off. What? And so I realize my story is kind of a unique narrative. Right? I realize that. But that's what's important here, that every person's journey is also a unique narrative. And hearing them out, I think, is a really important trait or aspect of interfaith dialogue, or just dialogue amongst people. Because how would you know all of that about me unless I really sat down and shared some of that information, right? So the story goes on, And people will ask me, why Syria? We're not even from there. So I alluded to some of the cool things that were happening in Syria about the time I was studying, but I want to talk about women in particular here. I want to tell you about the group of teachers that I studied with. And the story for them starts sometime in the early 70s, or sometime in the 70s, I should say, when we're definitely now in post-colonial era Syria, and we're at a time where women are really not in the forefront of anything, religion, secular or otherwise. And coming through Syria is this wave of feminism, if you will, and the start of women really showing up on college campuses and studying alongside men. Interestingly enough, there was this feeling of everything that is, and I would say this has a lot to do with what I call the post-colonial mentality. Everything that's considered to be tied to religion is archaic, and everything that's not religious is modern and good. And so we are here to emulate the West, if you will, that has colonized us, hence the post-colonial mentality that I'm speaking of. Although there is good, of course, in things like education, there is also harm in losing one's tradition and traditions and background. And so what you find it happening, for example, and what I understand from my time spent in Syria, was this was a period of time where you have, yes, women showing up on college campuses, but totally pushing aside everything called religion. So unveiling, and whereas that was very much part of the tradition there, and, you know, well, let's just say, it's important to note about Islam that the moral fiber of Islam is tied into the religion. So if you cast away religion, you also affect the moral fiber of a society. And so these women that I'm referring to were studying on college campuses, were getting high-level degrees, but were also feeling like there's something missing here. There's something that was very valuable in our own tradition that we have cast aside. And perhaps we should go back and actually study that and figure out what's going on. So there was a revival of sorts, if you will, in actually studying the religious tradition and scripture for themselves. Now, this was something that was difficult for them and not easily accessible. So they would go to male teachers, male religious scholars, and ask to be their students, and often were rejected again and again and again. But there were some male scholars who said, sure, if you're a diligent student, come on over, I'll teach you. And so with this first group of women who really started to, in the modern era that is, started to really take hold and study religious scripture and the various Islamic sciences for themselves, you really find something beautiful happening here. You find this emergence of a revival of female scholarship in Islam again. And with it, you find that they were studying Quran and Hadith. They were studying fiqh, Islamic law. They were studying all these different branches of the Islamic sacred sciences, while also studying the quote-unquote secular sciences. So they were also physicians or engineers or teachers or business owners, right? And this was interesting because you have to know about human psychology, that we often fear the unknown. So we criticize the unknown. And they were highly criticized. They were doing something that wasn't very typical or normative for their time. But that was no matter to them. Their interest was, we're here to work with women and children. Why? Well, no one's teaching the woman. And B, if you really want to change society, you start with the youngest members of it and train them and really have them grow up to be very open-minded people. So you start from scratch. So the very first institutions these women put together were preschools. Nobody was bothered by preschools. And it certainly didn't ruffle any male's feathers of any of the men or governmental agencies or whatever. And on they went, continuing to teach women and girls, women and kids, and so on and so forth, until you really find a very beautiful emergence of solid female scholarship. And it was in this time that I had started my journey to Syria. And by the time I got there, they had developed whole school systems for women and for girls and for kids. And I was studying in dormitories where college-age girls were studying at the University of Damascus, medicine, engineering, biology, literature, whatever they were studying during the daytime. And in the evenings, they were studying the sacred Islamic sciences, law, creed, theology, Quran, hadith, so on and so forth, which was really novel to considering where they were before and where they were at that time. So when I entered into the picture, there was this beautiful system set in place for girls and women to study Islam. And it was a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful opportunity. And it was something that I really strove to continue to go back and study. And so the deal with my parents, as you can imagine, if I continued to maintain my grades, which I did, I would go back and sure enough, did the same thing in high school, same thing in college that I did in high school, was get all the top that they ever wanted. And then spent what would have been my senior year of college also in Syria studying. So it's interesting to see because the parallels between my journey of studying, although on 2 different continents, paralleled what the girls that were my roommates there in Syria were also doing. Kind of tying between what you would call the worldly sciences, if you will, and the religious sciences. But you see, these domains are very important to my understanding of what it means to be a Muslim woman. Because in Islam, the understanding is you cannot separate one from another. You can't separate worldly matters from religious matters. You cannot separate what we call the deen, religion, from dunya, or worldly affairs. And the observant believer is one who perfects both domains. In fact, there are more than just the 2 domains. And this is what I also saw and really, really think is amazing about the woman I studied with. There are also the domains of womanhood that were addressed. It wasn't just study secular studies or let's say medicine and then study also religious studies, right? There was also the domain of all things related to womanhood, everything from etiquette to eventual wifehood to motherhood, to all these different parts of a woman that become very important and integral to who a woman might become one day. And if there isn't actual training in it, it becomes a little confusing of how you actually balance it all. And so when people ask me about my own journey, I say, well, I'm just emulating the woman I saw really balance things very well. And so the story goes on here where the story goes on here about in terms of my own journey with my teachers. And I want to say what's been really wonderful is to have not just been able to sit in circles like this where people are studying, rigorously, if you will, but also to know, and my teacher, one of my spiritual teachers has this really great, she loves to say this quote over and over, and she'd say, the proof is in the pudding. And what she meant by that is that if you really want to know if a person is truly successful, then you have to sort of be able to shadow them in every domain of their life. It's not just, are they doing well in their career, right? So they may excel in their career, but they're a terrible person at home, right? They may be doing really well keeping things together at home, but really can't balance much outside of the home, and so on and so forth. So if you really want to know the success of a person, you have to be able to shadow them in every domain of their life, the inner and the outer, right? And I had this wonderful opportunity because some of the best teaching moments for me wasn't even in the classroom. It was actually following them around their own homes, right? Either reciting Quran to them and having them correct me, or asking some complicated issue in Islamic law and having them, explain that to me while they were folding their laundry or washing their dishes. And that to me was probably, those were like golden moments and golden teaching opportunities. Because it means that a person was truly a well-rounded and full human, right? And that in and of itself is very much the Islamic teaching I was referring to earlier, that all things have to be in harmony and balance. And so here, if we talk a little bit more about kind of my time back here and what it meant after I came back, it's been a wonderful journey to be able to come back and serve the Muslim community here in America, which I've done for over 15 years now in all kinds of different capacities. And it goes back to where I started this discussion, where I said, if you were to see me walking down the street, could you really tell my true essence? So I mentioned how it would be very difficult to know that I was a physician unless you saw me in a white coat. And it'd be very difficult to know that I was a professor of Islamic law at the most prestigious American Muslim college, right? Unless you had maybe read that on my bio. But what's even more important than some of those credentials are the other domains of life. And for me, I would say the most important credential, better and most important than any other fancy degree or title, either from my medical studies or from my religious studies, is a very important certificate. And that's called Mom. So for me, thank you. For me, that means a lot. You know, when I entered into this new domain of motherhood and had children, I can tell you, it's not the legal questions that come into my inbox and on my phone, beeping all the time, all the texts that I receive, constantly questions coming through from students and from others. Nor is it figuring out what dosage of medication or whether I should hospitalize a patient that keeps me up at night. What actually keeps me up at night is trying to figure out the proper work-life study balance, right? It's the questions my kids ask me that stump me, that really keep me up at night. And to that, I really have, again, my teachers to thank here for showing me how to actually balance everything out properly. And for me, again, this is a personal narrative about women in Islam. I feel that I truly have met some of the most amazing women, put Muslim aside, just the most amazing women who walk this earth. I mean, people who really balanced all domains of life very, very well. And with that, I also want to say that if you were to just merely see me kind of walking down the street, there's other aspects that might be missed, right? And I keep driving this point home because I think it might actually be the most important point discussed this evening, which is that unless you really sit down with somebody else and actually listen to their narrative and actually understand where they're coming from, it's really hard not to have biases. We all have implicit biases, right? And it's really important to be able to work through some of that. And to be honest, I can't blame any of you if you have any sort of misconceptions, let's say, about Islam or about Muslim women or about women in general, considering that every candidate, or just about every candidate that's attempting to run for president of this country, feels the need to bash Muslims at this point in time. Right? It's a very unfortunate time, I feel, that we're in, and it's a difficult time for Muslims. And for those who are not Muslim who are listening to this, I think it's important to kind of realize where Muslims are standing in this current political climate. It doesn't feel very good, right? And at the same time, I feel that we have a lot to offer and have always offered to this country and continue to offer in general, right, to humanity. I also want to say that in order to really understand a Muslim, there are a couple of things we really should define. Perhaps you've heard Islam being translated as peace, or a religion of peace. Perhaps you've heard it translated as submission. And that a Muslim is one who submits to the will of God. Now that's really important because ultimately, that, especially that religion word, that big R word, tends to trouble people, right? I just actually got finished teaching a course to the Stanford residents called Culture and Religion and Psychiatry, and what it means to talk about religion. I mean, we actually call the whole course a can of worms because it's a difficult topic, right? Not talking about religion, that capital R, right, word. But I want to tell you that for Muslims, this whole idea of it being archaic or old school, or that these rules don't apply in the modern era, is actually not accurate at all for a Muslim. In fact, as you may already know, Islam is in a lineage of the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It's a trilogy, if you will, and it kind of goes. And the understanding is, in the former religions, the Islamic understanding that is that they were for a certain group of people at a certain era and a certain time, whereas Islam is understood by Muslims to be the final message, and understood of God, and understood to be a religion for all times and all places and all people. But that also means that it is implementable in every era, and in every country, and in every location, by every ethnicity, and by every language group. And it also means that it's not owned by any one group of people, nor is it claimed or can be claimed by any one group of people. So this is actually a really important understanding of Islam, because it ties right back into our discussion of what does it mean to be not just a Muslim woman, but also a Muslim woman who lives here in America. What does it mean to be American Muslims, right? And so here I have to say, where I started off before, that I try my very best to implement the rules that I have learned. And for me, this is not a pass-me-down religion. For me, these are not pass-me-down rules that my father or mother or parents attempted to enforce. In fact, they acknowledge that I'm more knowledgeable in their religion than they, but they will always be more knowledgeable wisdom-wise than I will, than myself. So, this whole thing of owning it for myself and actually learning and studying the tradition myself and scripture myself has been incredibly, incredibly helpful for me to feel and to be very solid and confident about what it is and who it is that I am. I also want to say that, there are other aspects of my journey that have been really, really wonderful. And just like it'd be hard to tell that I was a physician without knowing and talking to me, or that I was a professor of Islamic law, or that I was the founding director of an educational religious nonprofit called the Rahma Foundation, which its mission is to educate Muslim women and girls. It'd be very hard to know, for example, that we've set up here in the Bay Area all kinds of great programs in schools in the study of Quran for women and girls. That we have a world-renowned, and at least nationally renowned, summer camp for girls. That, for example, we have this really great networking system, mentoring system for college-age girls, college-age young women, and young adults who want to go back and mentor Muslim youth, and so on and so forth. I mean, there's a lot of aspects of who a person might be that don't really readily come through just by looking at them. That's true of me and true of every one of you. And so I want to share that and say that this is kind of the most, these are some of the most important points that I have learned in trying to implement all the different domains of what I believe to be a Muslim woman to be. And so I don't want to keep you terribly long, and I want to give some time for questions before we end here. But I did reference a couple of verses, or at least a verse and a prophetic narration that I want to give you the exact wording of, since I referenced them earlier in my talk. So I'm going to end actually in sharing what those are. So I referenced earlier how I meant to reference, I think earlier, I can't remember now, but that when we talk about women in Islam, that Islam's view of this, and the proper implementation, if you will, is that the woman is considered to be equal, or shaqa'iq, or the other half of men. And so this point of view, or this lens, is a very important lens, but is not implemented perfectly by any stretch of imagination in current society, and probably historically too. But if you look at the pure form of scripture, that is actually what it says. Also, that it's not about what you look like, or who you are, or what ethnicity you are, but in the sight of God, it's actually the best of people, or the best of deeds, are the highest in the sight of God, which is also important when we talk about aspects of spirituality, especially as we talk about women. That there is nothing that prevents a woman from attaining the highest levels and ascension in spirituality, just as a man might. Absolutely nothing. And so I mention those points because I think it's really important, and sometimes that can kind of gets lost in translation unless it's really explicitly said. So the verse that I want to share with you is from the Noble Quran. It is chapter 49, verse 13, and it says, "O people, we have created you from a man and a woman, and made you into peoples and tribes, so that you may know one another. Verily, the most honorable amongst you in the sight of God are the most pious." So the verse here is referring to men and women, right? Both together. And God says that He created peoples and tribes to actually get to know one another. And all of that put aside, regardless of gender, regardless of tribe, regardless of origin and heritage, the most righteous, or the most pious, or the most special, if you will, in the eyes of God, are those who are the most pious. So I think that's very important, and that's actually the basis of creed in Islam. If we look at the prophetic narration, the same principles apply there. It says, God does not look at your outer form, nor your bodies, but he looks at your hearts and your deeds. That too kind of speaks to the same idea here. And I think that's really important. And I wanted to share the exact wording of these references, or these statements, since I had referenced them earlier. So I'll end with that and give you all some time to ask any questions you might have. Yes.
Congratulations. Great accomplishment. I am from Homs. I'm a Muslim. My grandfather was the Mufti of Homs. So I come from a religious background. The one thing that has confused me about Islam, and still does, and I still don't comprehend, is how are you half me? How can that be? The Quran says so. When you are going to give testimony in court, your testimony is half me. When you are going to inherit from your father, you get half me. Everything is half me. How is that?
Not quite, actually. It'd be really helpful if you went to the Islamic law class.
No, but you did, and that's your job. Explain it,
Happy
please.
to explain it. I'm happy to. I do want to say that this, of course, conversation is a very legal conversation and will take more than the time we have allotted here. However, to help and answer or shed a little bit of light, here's the most important thing I have learned about Islamic law. Context is everything. So if you try to pinpoint and try to take out specific rulings, you're going to miss the point.
I don't miss the point that my sister gets half what I get.
I'm trying to explain. Context is everything. So the understanding here, for example, you're referring to inheritance. For inheritance, first of all, we should know that whoever has inheritance to give may, before their passing, decide to distribute that however they wish, first of all. Many people miss that point, okay? So if a father says, I actually want my daughter to have everything, he may do so.
My grandfather didn't miss it. He didn't give any to his
I
daughters.
don't know about your grandfather. I'm speaking from Islamic law here. Secondly, I would like to say what's important is that if a person did not take any preemptive measures, maybe it was a sudden death, they never really had any preemptive measures, the religion then puts in place specific criteria to help relegate and really stop infighting as much as possible. And so what it goes on to say, and here's where context is important, where is the legal responsibility of, let's say, the parents once they age? Well, Islamic law says the son, if there is a son, carries the burden of this responsibility, not the daughter. Hence, in inheritance, the son inherits more with the understanding that he is then fully responsible for caring for those parents. In a way, the daughter is not at all responsible. She may, out of her own charity and goodwill. This is important to understand the broader picture and context. But I'll stop here because that's a very legal discussion which we may come to at a different time in a different location. Other questions?
So I have one comment. It's really quick. So basically, okay, I won't mention anything legal about Islam because basically, there's actually some situations when actually the daughter will take everything and the man won't take anything at all. So it's really deep in fiqh thing. So basically, if you just refer to a book, you'll find it actually
But
in
that's
detail.
not what the Quran says. The Quran says half.
Are there other questions?
Okay,
Yes.
I have. Can I go on with my question?
So did you have a question?
Yeah. So my question is actually, so basically, the whole point of your story actually was your own will. You want to do something and you will do it. So can you just give us any tips of anyone would love to do anything and you don't have enough will to do it, or just do you have any advice of that? Because basically I met so many Muslim women, they want to do something but they can't really do it.
Sure.
All
people. All people.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. All people. I'll share with you a story that I really, really like, and it's a story that talks about exactly what you mean. If you're talking about will, or if I may translate it into time. People say, I just don't have the time or the capacity to do such and such. I'm so inspired by what I've heard or what I've seen, but I don't know how to actually carry this out myself. So from the Islamic spiritual tradition comes a really beautiful story where there is a student and a teacher. And the teacher wants to teach the essence of time or capacity to the student. And so it says to the student, tell me everything you know about time. And so the student attempts to explain. And the teacher isn't satisfied. So the teacher says, look, I'll tell you what. Go get me a box. And fill this box up with balls. And fill it up to the very top. So the student goes and gets as many balls as he can find, or she can find, I'm not sure exactly the narration if it was a he or she here, and fills up as much as they are able to. Maybe like tennis ball sized balls, okay? And so fills it to the top and presents it back to the teacher. And says, the teacher says, so is this full? And the student says, yes, I believe it is. Teacher says, absolutely not. Go back and fill the box more, but this time with smaller sized balls. So the student goes off and gets maybe like bouncing ball kind of size balls and tries to fill it up. And the story goes back and forth to where the student then tries marbles and then tries something even smaller and finally says, I really think the box is full. And the teacher says, the box is not full. And the student's just bewildered, like what else can I possibly fill in this box? And the teacher says, try sand. And so he takes sand and fills, pours it in, and it kind of sinks to the bottom all the way through and kind of really does fill the box and says, I think you can't get anything smaller than a speck of sand. We must be done. The teacher says, you're not done. Now go get a glass of water. Pour it over the top. And now the box truly is full. The whole point the teacher is teaching the student here is that sometimes we feel like we can't do any more. But a lot of times those limits are really much more in our imagination than they are in reality. What it's also teaching us is that if you try, this whole concept of if there's a will, there's a way, right? If you try, and the Islamic rendition of that, if you will, is if you try, God opens the doors, right? If there was good intention behind it and so on. So often what my teachers would say every time we'd go, no, I can't possibly take on one more task or one more thing. They'd say, look, if you were meant to, because this concept for people of faith, is if you were meant to, if it was part of your calling, if it was part of your religious, divine decree, if you will, then you shall be able to do so. And if not, then the door will close, and it's not meant for you. So just keeping that in mind, I think, is useful. Sure.
Okay, so I'm just going to allude to an example, not because I'd like sort of a legal interpretation of it, just because it feeds into a bigger point about gender and Islam. So I'm from Switzerland, and recently it became a national scandal where two Muslim kids refused to shake the hands of their teacher because she was a woman. And all I'm asking is, regardless of what the legal reasons are, whether that's truly what's taught, what is actually the reason for that, how is the West supposed to link its notions of gender equality, that male teacher's hand is to be shaken, a female teacher's hand is to be shaken? How are they supposed to make that compatible with sort of Islamic interpretations of gender equality? And what sort of, really in terms of gender equality, what do we ought to do?
Sure. Yeah, the handshaking question is actually, I think, a great one, in fact, because it's very much part of Western culture, if you will. And I use the word Western culture very liberally here, but I do say it because you don't really find this as a common in Eastern culture, for example. And when we talk about Islam and Islamic rulings, the reason, and I don't know what the kids were thinking or what the exact story was, but again, back to this idea of context is everything, right? So if we understand and if we are trying really, really, really hard not to put our own biases on things or even a Western lens on things, but rather put it more as and here I'm going to talk a little bit of anthro talk, but if you kind of have you're very careful not to take the binoculars, right, with, again, these implicit biases and put them onto another culture or another group of people, I think it becomes a little more clear what's going on. There's rulings, for example, that say men and women who are not relatives of each other should not touch, even physical touch. So this means even token touching, like shaking hands or a high five. And whereas this is very much part of Western, and let's even just use American culture, it becomes very confusing for people who are like, why don't you want to shake my hand, right? What's going on here? Unless they have this backdrop or understanding of where this is coming from. where this is much more part of the faith. So is it an issue at all of equality? Actually, it doesn't even enter the realm of equality because it's not a matter of the man versus the woman in this case. It's much more, it's actually much higher spiritually than that in the discussion of what does it mean for men and women not to touch, right, before, if they're not relatives, right, or they're not each other's spouse. So here we would say, so what do you do with that in Switzerland or here in America? And so there have been, this is where we get into some of the legal opinions of what does it mean and how could you go about it and so on and so forth. And I've had to negotiate this all throughout my career, like all throughout my career. And when I've been able to, and when I've had the moment to be able to speak and say, you know, culturally or religiously, this is not part of my tradition or norm. And that way the person in front of me isn't just sort of taken aback and bewildered by my actions, but is actually able to understand where it's coming from. It's actually worked just great. In fact, often I get, it's usually men in this case, who will say, okay, you know, it kind of like sparks a memory that they may have had that this is the case, but have forgotten. And then there's all kinds of Muslims too, and all kinds of levels of practice. I mean, Islam is a spectrum and continuum of practice. So you'll find all types of people, some who are very comfortable shaking hands and don't even think twice, and others who prefer not to. So it's very much an individual practice of the religion too, right? So here I would just say the best place to start is, let's just remember that everyone, especially in a very heterogeneous country like America, people are coming from all different kinds of backgrounds. And it's not even a matter of a acculturation here. You know, this whole idea of the tossed salad versus the melting pot, right? Is it like, you know, what is this country meant to be? And often it's argued the pros and cons of each. But I really like the tossed salad a whole lot more, where we each have a little bit more of the other since we're all together, but we haven't melted into one thing. Because that really takes away, you know, the real beauty of all the different cultures that are here. Some thoughts. Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Sure.
You mentioned being involved in some Muslim mental health initiatives around in the Bay Area. Could you talk a little bit more about how you see faith being used as a source of healing for people?
Sure. Yeah. You know, there's a whole literature on faith-based counseling, and it stems from this idea that if somebody comes from a faith tradition, not always, but many times, it's actually something that could be used as a resource or help for them. And that if a clinician completely ignored that side of them, it might actually be to their detriment, because it could be something that really helps them in a time of need. And so this idea of tying in Islam, or what I was thinking of it, it's actually interesting, and I could talk about this topic forever. And I think we might actually have some talks later on that are actually based on this idea of mental health in Islam that I'll be doing later on in the semester. But just briefly to mention that for me, again, part of my actual studies, like my actual Islamic religious studies, led me to the field of psychiatry and counseling, because I realized that there's actually very strong roots in Islam on counseling and mental health. An amazing, amazing history that Muslims actually have in the field of mental health that have, and some of my publications have actually been on this, some of the amazing advancements they have in what we would call the golden era of Islam historically, which are like 7th to 9th century. But it sort of stopped there. And my worry was, or my issue with this is, often psychiatry, psychology, and so on is seen as a Western construct, and my argument back is often, no, really it's not, right? Yes, the modern field very much is, but there's so much that is found in Eastern tradition and also found in religious tradition that very much informs even what we call modern psychology. So I'll leave it at that because it's a very long discussion and lots to be shared. So hopefully we'll have a different chance to talk about that more. Yes.
Have you felt on a hot day like this that you wish you could wear a t-shirt?
Absolutely.
Or just moments that you question the law or wondering, why do I have to do this? Or
Sure.
any hope for reform of the laws or even people's adaptation and interpretations?
Yeah, so have I felt hot? Have there been days where you're just like, what am I doing? Yeah, and I would say not just with the hijab, but really with so many things in my life, I go, what am I doing? And I think that's only normal and only human. So yes, I have felt that sometimes, and I think that's, if I didn't, there'd be something very much wrong with my thermostat. But to answer the other part of your question, which I also think is important, is there a place for reform or so on and so forth? And here I would say, again, we have to be super, super careful not to view any other than ourselves, right, with a pair of binoculars that's tinted in some way. So as Muslims may say, like I was mentioning earlier, if Islam is meant to be a religion for all times and all places and all peoples, and one of the religious injunctions is modesty of both men and women, and the understanding of modesty is covering, right, then where is the reform if that's actually an essence of the very religion, if you understand what I'm trying to say. So here, again, this idea of, and I didn't share about, actually one thing I didn't share that I would like to, about the teachers I was referring to that I studied with in Syria. What's so interesting is that wave of feminism that I was talking about earlier was seen as sort of a type of reform, if you will, to all things religious or archaic. And there was a time where Syria saw a blooming of miniskirts, right, which is very much opposite of the tradition, if you will. And the woman that I'm talking about, the group of women who then became female scholars, right, were the very ones to say, hey, there's something wrong here. We actually, we have a tradition here that was very, very elegant and very, very nice. In addition, and education doesn't interfere with that, and nor are the two things mutually exclusive. Women's education, right, and modesty, right, and rules. And so it's interesting to see that after a wave of everybody unveiling, or so many people unveiling, that there was this wave again, or surge of veiling that happened. So what is reform, right, is really the question. So I want to say all of that, and I say all of that just to show that sometimes the actual reform is to go back to the tradition that actually has lots of value to it. Does that make sense? Yeah.
If I may push forward what you just said, we're actually from China. In ancient China, there were also some, traditional rules regarding women's dress, and women even had to bind their feet and things like that. But as society modernized, we also changed those traditions, and some rules and traditions also modernized. So, as my friend here, I also have this question as to yes, we do need to put value on traditions and respect that, but does that mean that our traditions should stay static all the time and over the years or things like that?
Right. Yeah, so here I want to explain again that what I'm trying to refer to when I say tradition, I mean religious tradition. So again, this idea, if Muslims have the understanding that this is the word of God and the injunction of God here in terms of religious rules, not just cultural values, but actual religious rules that are divine, remember divine, from God. So do we as humans have the room to elbow them out in what we would call reform? This is a high debate question that the field of theology spends a lot of time debating. But here what I want to say is, and really emphasize, that these are religious injunctions and religious rules. I started my entire narrative to explain and to say how really there was nothing that this prevented in reaching the highest of academic caliber, if you will, the best of schooling, the best of education, the best of leadership, and so on and so forth. And this is true historically too. So you find that interestingly enough, Muslim women have always been leaders and political voices. They have always been governors. They have always been, in fact, we still don't have a female president of this country, and you have Muslim countries that have female presidents and have been presidents for many a decade. And so I want to say all this to say that this dress does not prohibit a woman to be able to go out and do really anything she wishes to do. This is a source of modesty and divine injunction. I hope that's a little more clear.
Sure.
Yes?
Could you explain what you mean by piety? And if you have a spectrum of practices across the Muslim faith, what defines a pious person as being, I guess, the most honorable or revered type of person that there could be?
You're referring to the verse where it's saying the most pious.
Yes.
Yeah. The understanding here is that it's much, so it's interesting. Islam, if we look at it, it's very much talks about tying together the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. And so the spirit of the law, or spirituality, is actually a very important component of Islam. And really any group of people that have attempted to just implement law, or maybe you may hear the term Sharia or Sharia law, just as law, and takes away the spiritual aspect of it, fail miserably, as you see often, especially in modern contexts. But I mean to say by that, and the word pious here, really is referring to the spiritual aspect of what? Of this connection with God, and also the implementation of the laws that He has sent down. So bringing the two together is actually what we understand to be the most pious of people. The one who's able to, and really strives, the word here strives, to implement the laws of God for the human being, and also connects on a spiritual level with God. And that is seen to be the most pious person. Other questions? Other thoughts? Yes?
So you mentioned there's a post-colonial sort of sense that foreshadow a lot of things who were historically very much in the center of Islamic theology and law. Are there any, I guess, Muslim women from that time particularly inspired you, or that you look up to?
You mean historically?
Yes.
Yeah, sure. Plenty. Plenty. I mean, I would start even as far back as the earliest generations of Islam, to tell you the truth. Some of the most inspirational stories come from the very era of the Prophet, peace be upon him, when he was still living, and certainly from the women who came in the era after them. I think I was probably most inspired by understanding and learning that the Quranic tradition and the Hadith tradition, which we base everything really of Islam on, Quran and Hadith, could not be in the state that it is today if it were not for female scholars. That in every line of, when I say line here, I'm talking about in the narration of Hadith, the way you do this properly, it goes from person to person to person to person to person, right? From the Prophet all the way down to whoever is currently reciting this narration. And it has to be an unbroken chain of narration, because if there's a break in it, you can't actually take it to be, it may be fabricated. So this idea here, that in that line, you have not just one woman, but several women through, who were the most knowledgeable and scholarly of their era. And that was amazing to me. I don't think it actually clicked until I actually studied it. I was like, oh wow, we are where we are today, and the knowledge we have today, and the sciences that have become full sciences today, by female scholarship. And I think that was a very powerful lesson. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I just wanted to know if you have any book recommendations for further reading about Islamic law specifically.
About Islamic law?
Mm-hmm.
What part of Islamic law are you thinking?
I'm really interested in kind of the development of it, the history of it, looking at the methodologies and how they were developed, and
Sure.
And then also continuing on not just from the classical period, but then how to recover that in the post-colonial era, and dealing with Western epistemologies, if that makes sense.
Sure.
And how does Islamic law continue to be relevant in the modern world?
Yeah, there's some great references. Probably a really good place I would start is it's a big book, but it's a really easy read called The Four Imams. And it kind of discusses how there's four schools of Sunni laws and how each one was developed, and how each of what was kind of unique about each of the schools of law. And it goes on and kind of talks a little bit more to how that ties into the modern era. So it's a good starting place, I would say, if you wanted to start there. All right. Any last minute concerns? Yeah, go ahead. We'll take another one.
What roles do you think Muslim women play in trying to prevent or stop further extreme Muslim terrorist attacks or those kind of things?
The question is, what role can the Muslim woman play?
Yeah.
Yeah?
In stopping that.
In stopping extremism?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so great question. I would say that really, male or female, I think the best role any of us can play is to really be a walking example of what Islam actually is, right? And to be very careful that the rhetoric that's thrown out there all the time, and it seems really scary, and I'm with you, it's scary, right, is not, is put back in its proper context. And to be very honest with you, a lot of that has to do with actual practical implementation of it on daily life. So my first recommendation to anybody who's Muslim is to really implement all of the teaching, not just sort of parts and pieces of it. Because I think at that point, Islam will go from being seen or even implemented as an extremist form to actually very moderate form, which is its essence and what it was meant to be. And that would be where my starting advice would be.
Great. Thank you everyone for coming.
Yeah, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Awaad.
Sure, it was great to see you all, and I'll be around for a few minutes if you have individual questions. Take care. Bye.
Not today, because I have way too much work.
Advice?
Yeah, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.